I suppose, session is all around a theory and a theory of change that comes from a movement called Gesturing Towards a Decolonial Future. So it's a group of artists, activists and educators who do a lot of research and a lot of, I suppose, pedagogy forming based on global justice issues. A lot of the research comes directly from the Indigenous groups that they work with. They're because many of the movement are based in the reservation in British Columbia, but they've done research all throughout the world. So really, I suppose it's a combination of both kind of academia and also like the voices of Indigenous people all around the world. So just, I suppose, acknowledge that. Just, I suppose, one thing that came up in the first idea session, the house is not necessarily about, like, you know, the way the West and the global South. It's not about North and South. The house is really about privilege. So just to acknowledge that, it's not necessarily like, you know, the way one part of the world and the other part of the world. It is about how we live today, our kind of dominant sensibility, our dominant way of living in the world. So I'm going to share my screen now, and what we're going to do is kind of construct the house bit by bit as we go along. If you've any questions, this is a small group, so please do heckle, that's okay, and do ask questions or any clarifications. I think I've simplified it to the best I can without kind of losing the complexity of it, but there still might be some things that might be slightly unclear, and I'd love you to maybe just butt in and ask for clarification if needs be. Is that okay? Great. Off we go. We're going to build a house today, guys. So, okay. So, the house of that modernity built is, I suppose this is the basic structure of it. You can see actually behind me, I have, like, you know, the way I've done several drawings of this, and it's more from my own kind of reflection and comprehension of the house itself. But I'd like you first of all to guess, there's a big blue circle underneath in which the house is plonked on. What do you think that symbolizes? So the house is plonked upon this big blue circle.
I've obviously watched you do this before. Will I still give examples?
I'd like somebody else maybe too. But if not, if nobody comes to me in 2 seconds, I'd like you to put in, please.
It's the garden around it.
It's a garden around it. Okay, interesting. Kind of like, you know, the way that is actually, like, you know, the way there's some truth to that, but.
Oh, I was going to say the plot of land.
Plot of land, also another clue, but it's kind of a combination of, well, these two things could be, yeah, are possibly in this circle.
It's the barrier between the outside and the inside.
Okay, barrier, interesting as well, not necessarily a barrier. So, Laura, can you tell the guys what it is?
It's the Earth.
Yes, so it's the planet. So, I suppose one of the main kind of premises of looking at the house of that modernity built is that we're exceeding the limits of the planet. So you can see it just plonked on the planet. So we're already kind of exceeding it, okay? But because some of the reasons why we're exceeding the planet and the limits of the planet is that over layers and layers of I suppose centuries of the way that we live and live in a very much kind of consumer society, we've almost kind of separated ourselves from the earth. We've separated our connection with nature. But we've also separated our connection with other human beings and other than humans. So the planet would encompass, like, you know, the way plants and animals. So we're very much separated. I suppose the other thing about this foundation of the house is that the foundations are based on very much a colonial past as well, and very much like, you know, the way building kind of that barrier that the planet is just there for humans to use as a resource and for us to continue to extract from. Okay, so that's the foundations of the house.
You said
the
I
foundations
can.
of the house have a little bit more to them as we go on, and I'll say that. Yeah.
Sorry, you said you can intervene. You use the word colonial past. I don't quite understand that in the context of how houses and plants, you know, they existed before the colonial period.
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah, no, but I suppose that the house that modernity built is about modernity. So it is about, I suppose, building our, whereas I suppose it's not only about our colonial past, it is about, like, you know, the way how we, you know, civilization has used the earth.
Okay.
Said that the outside of the house and the planet itself, and you'll see this as I kind of grow the layers to the house. It also includes people who don't live in the house and don't have access to some of the privileges that the house allows us to have. But really, I suppose that the reason why the colonial past is at the bottom, that it is, and I suppose the Industrial Revolution, so it's really about history, has built these layers that have really separated us from nature itself and our appreciation of nature. So it really is around extraction and, like, you know, the way resource usage, instead of us treating the planet and other than humans as equal, we're slightly separated from that. Okay.
Is it like the premise? It's like the premise of modernity. I don't even know how to say that word.
Modernity, yeah.
Modernity.
Yeah.
Modernity is that separation, and that was the basis of colonial, like, history, was to just extract, to take, to So people and the planet was all, it's built, the foundations of that are built on just extraction and separation from the planet.
Yeah, whereas previous civilizations, the societies would have been very much built, and still are to this day, but more for people who live outside the house. Their societies were very much built on their connection with nature, instead of, I suppose, our kind of very modern society, which in general isn't. We could argue now that, oh, I have a very good connection with nature personally, but as a society, we don't. And our structures and our systems don't support us having a really good connection with nature. And that's just, I suppose, the way it is. It's really, I mean, there's so many layers, I suppose, to this house. And again, I suppose I always, and as like, you know, global citizenship education, we have to acknowledge, like, this is one theory that is there also to be like torn apart, to be criticized, and there's different parts that you, like, you know, you won't agree with initially, and that's okay, because we're all about giving kind of very much different perspectives on this. I think it's a good stimulus to maybe start that conversation. And maybe just to put the world and how it works into kind of perspective in quite a simple cartography that we're looking at here. So, foundations, exceeding the limit of the planet, but also what's kept and what the supporting wall of this house has been universal knowledge. So a dominant kind of sensibility that in our world, that we kind of believe, now Aidan, you're going to hate this, but we believe only in scientific data and knowledge to be able to I suppose, continue in our world. The reason why this supporting wall is here, and the message around it, is that we've actually, like, there's one kind of dominant culture we like a monoculture. So it's what a good example would be, I suppose, the danger of a single story. So promoting kind of one kind of single story outside the different types of knowledges have been excluded from this and are seen as worthless, are seen as sometimes kind of savage or backwards. So it's kind of an acknowledgement that, like, you know, the way, okay, because we have all of our, like, you know, the way world is based on, like, you know, the way just knowledge. We're only, like, you know, the way our way of being is only about our thought processes, not necessarily about our gut or our connection with nature. Any questions about that? I had a little bit of a problem with this at first.
Yeah, I think sometimes I find this very narrowing.
Yeah.
I can see how you're building a foundation for an argument, but I would have thought that we are both rational beings and emotional beings anyway. So, you know, it's the idea that, you know, this universal knowledge is, and that I think knowledge itself has a peculiar element to it, which is that knowledge sometimes helps you become more isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas before, if you had, say, the church before was a unifying thing, now it doesn't exist. So that there's a gap, an emotional gap for a lot of people. And, you know, so I'm just saying, it's
absolutely. And you put it very well, Aidan. It is that it's, you know, we're all almost like it's all based on rational rather than emotional knowledge. Like another word that is put there on that side of the wall is like the Enlightenment. So like the theory of Enlightenment during the Renaissance, like, you know, the way, so we're, you know, it was kind of striving us forward through, you know, the way that we must progress and progress and progress. So that's had an impact and an implication on our kind of growth model, that we're just, you know, the way looking at this kind of linear growth, as opposed to, like, you know, the way looking at and you know, becoming over civilized. So it's also tied in with that, without a connection or an emotional connection with land, other humans, and other than humans. Okay, so the next one
is just for universal knowledge, I suppose. My understanding would have been, I suppose, like that knowledge isn't knowledge, for example, unless it has like a scientific like unless it's in a journal, or unless it's like peer review. Like it's kind of like that we've created, like that knowledge is only knowledge if we've created a system that says it is it is facts checked, and it is, so it's kind of based on kind of very, and that would be kind of a Western thing, kind of a Western kind of like
unless it's written down, it's not true, or it's not worthy of being, like, you know, the way of being considered in any decision making. That's kind of another, I suppose, way to put it, like, you know, unless it's written down, it's not worthy. So I suppose, like, you know, it does exclude then so many. It excludes wisdom, I think, is the main kind of crux of it. Like, you know, the way wisdom and ancient wisdom and wisdom that's been with us for generations in different cultures and different civilizations. And they're just, I suppose, it's, the like you said, a single story, without acknowledging any other good type of wisdom. And unless it's scientifically proven, it can't be it's useless to us.
Can I just challenge that one? Sorry.
Absolutely. I love this. I suppose this is the conversation
coming in, sorry.
That's good about this.
Sorry, Aidan. Yeah, no, I was just, this actually came up recently, and about, you know, we were talking about like science papers. Is there a science paper to back this theory up? So what it does essentially, for me, I have an issue with that, because it's excluding then the alternative.
Yes.
You know, the holistic, the spiritual, you know, side of aspect of things. You know, we're just completely ignoring them. Then, you know, that we're taking them for granted. You know, so it is an interesting concept, and I'm interested to hear more.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're totally right. And I mean, there is exceptions, like, you know, I suppose like yoga would be kind of one of the exceptions where, you know, it was kind of almost cultural appropriation, but just, you know, the way that we embraced that into, like, you know, the way, because it was good for, it fulfilled a lot of our kind of desires and needs living within the house. So, you know, an ancient kind of knowledge that, like, you know, of how we be and how we spiritually and our well-being. But there's very few, you know, examples where that happens.
On the other hand, I wouldn't like to go up on a plane that was founded on the principles of some ancient knowledge. If I would prefer to be, you know, have a rational basis for why it's assembled in a particular way and goes through the sky.
Yeah.
So I think I you know, I just, I'm a bit cautious about the negativity.
Absolutely, and Aidan, like, you're right. If you were getting on a plane, you'd want, like, you know, the way, you definitely want the universal knowledge. If you were forming a relationship with somebody, and I don't mean like a, you know, but any type of relationship, you'd need the other types of knowledge and wisdom to be able to carry forward that relationship, if you know what I mean. So it is definitely different. And I suppose this is a model that we look at how the world works, and particularly on global justice issues. And I suppose it's constructing how maybe we got to this point where we have, you know, really abject inequalities in the world, and maybe some of the reasons why we have that, and why it hasn't, like, you know, the way, we haven't overcome all those inequalities. So you know, definitely.
Throw in something there. I would have you talked about relationships. I think it's based on broken relationships.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not based on just the fact that we've, I mean, you know, that it's a universal knowledge has been the problem. You know, no. I think it's how we bring them all together and how they're all, you know, how they all exist in relationship to each other.
Yeah.
You know, anyway, it's just,
absolutely. I think that, like, the main word, like the universal part is more important than the knowledge part, if you know what I mean. It's the universality of thinking of only, like, that there's only one way to think, and that's it.
And yeah. I would also argue that it's kind of like, I suppose it's the hierarchy of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of fundamentally saying that, you know, we've created a hierarchy, and that inequality means, the inequality of kind of knowledge means that we put this universal knowledge to the very kind of helm, and nearly all other knowledge is either discounted or discredited, not valued, and therefore the people not valued. So it's this kind of like system of like, well, if you're at the top and you understand knowledge the way that, say, for example, we've been schooled, and you're civilized, and the other people aren't. And I suppose that's the kind of awareness to identify that exists, and that's part of this house of modernity. That would be my understanding, like, agree or disagree with the concept.
Yeah.
That's the kind of premise, I suppose.
For sure. And it is about, like, you know, the way we have it in our definition. It is about, like, you know, seeing different perspectives, which is kind of rarely, like, you know, the way it is done. But, like, you know, we need to, like, you know, teachers say, and ourselves need to always see different perspectives on, say, a thematic area that they're exploring. They need to see, whether they agree with it or not, they need to see, like, what are the different perspectives and the different opinions on that, what are, like, you know, what are the, you know, the other thoughts on this, and also, you know, trying to break that kind of dominant, I suppose, the dominant narrative on it. And really it is about the dominant narrative. So maybe it is, I think if maybe doing this with teachers, say, or anything, maybe, like, you know, this wall should be kind of called something else, like the dominant narrative possibly might be a better kind of word for it, like, you know, the way, because it did, to be honest, when it was described to me first, I really did have a problem with that.
Yeah, I think the dominant narrative might be interesting.
Yes, yeah. True. Great, actually. That's great. This is brilliant, guys. Thanks a million. So, this is actually also another wall that I had a little bit of a problem with. You know, I didn't realise that I was so proud to be of my nation. So it's the nation state. So the nation state really, it does represent the structures and the systems that keep the house in place. And it represents the laws. So for instance, tax laws. It represents, I suppose, a very kind of recent and it represents policing. So our local example, I mean, our most recent example of, you know, policing in America, and how you know, how that panned out with George Floyd, etc. And that's only our most recent example. So it's on how, like, you know, our nation state as such, or the laws under that nation state have protected the house. Another good example, I suppose, would be on how like we're continuing, I suppose, with the wall in Mexico, that idea of the fortress Europe, that we're, like, you know, the way we're really, like, you know, looking at securing and making sure that nobody gets into the house. So it would be immigration laws, for instance, direct provision, how we kind of, like, you know, I suppose, legislate, and how these structures have kept inequality in place. Okay, everybody okay so far?
Yeah. Sorry for challenging.
Absolutely not, Aidan. This is great, and it kind of gives
because
ideas.
while I mean, I kind of go along with some of the things you're saying, but the idea of a wall there and the nation state is a protective thing as well, maybe from you know, outside conquest, if you wish. You know, so, I mean, there is a protective element to it, as well as the elements you're talking about. You know, now I understand the coercive nature of a nation state. You know, that, you know, certain components within it have the right to bear arms and others don't, and this, that, and the other, and you know, the policing, whatever. But there is another positive side to it. You know, that it is it's an encompassing of a particular agreed culture. You know, so it's just that it has two sides to it. You know.
Absolutely. And this is, as I said, I was surprised about my reaction to this, like, you know, of my identity as an Irish person, and, you know, our young, relatively young nation, you know, that people, like, you know, the way strive so hard to achieve. So, but really it is around, like, you know, if we, you know, and maybe it is changing the kind of language around that as well, of, like, structures and systems that keep this in place. Aoife and Laura, any kind of feedback on that? Like, you know, the way that particular one, I actually must see that in my drawing. Yep, okay. All good? Yeah, okay. So obviously the roof of the and this is, I guess, about, like, you know, the way our society, how it runs. I'm loath to use the word capitalism as such, because then, like, you know, it seems like an anti-capitalism model. Slightly is, but it is around, like, you know, the way that our roof is made by global capital, and we're all kind of striving towards access to this global capital that we have. It's also had huge influence then on the fact that we're always utility maximizing, and we're always looking to kind of, I suppose, make a profit on what we can kind of make out of this. And it's been supported and also had a huge influence on nation state and universal knowledge, and our own kind of way of being and thinking. Okay, everybody clear about that? One thing to note is that
sorry about this. Sorry. I'll have to leave soon, you know, at 11 o'clock. I have this other meeting, you know, the Educate Together. But the global capital actually undermines the nation state as well.
Yes,
You know?
that's
So
what I was just saying.
it's a wobbly connection.
Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. So we've seen that. I think a really good kind of like, example here is, say, the trade agreements, like, well, TIP, which is gone now, but CETA, like, that actually global capital and, say, multinational companies can, like, the way can sue nation states if their environmental or their ethical working practices are too stringent. So, like, obviously, like, our politics have been very much run by global capital. And then if you even look at like debt relief compared to bank bailouts in 2008, like, it's 4 times the amount that the debt relief was given to developing countries, say, since the Jubilee campaign. So I suppose this is where you can have a really good discussion about, like, the way the relationship between the different walls and the roof as well. I always like to say as well that there's no skylight in this house on the roof. So all of the hidden costs of building this house are very much hidden. There's no windows or there's no skylights for us to, the way possibly to see what the hidden costs of this house are. And that's what we're going to look at next, okay? So for, what do you think the brown arrow on the left is? So it's coming from the planet and it's going into the house. Anybody?
Energy?
Hmm? Energy, one of them, yeah, definitely. One of the things. So
resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the way. So we're actually completely, and we have done for centuries, appropriating so much from our planet. Can anybody maybe give me some examples of what we're bringing out? So energy, one of them, definitely. So our sources of energy, including, I suppose, you can bring in, like, fossil fuels, but then you can also bring in, like, the fact that our lithium is also being mined in places like Bolivia, and we're still continuing to extract, even though under the we haven't, even though it's green energy and it's good for the environment and it's good for our earth, but then we're still extracting from the earth and extracting from communities that are not really getting the benefits of us extracting. Okay, what do you think the other arrow going the other way is? So we have one that's taking, like, minerals, it's taking energy sources, it's taking people, it's taking cultures, it's taking land, so there, we can give plenty of examples there where but what would be going back out of the house and into the planet?
Emissions.
Absolutely, perfect example. So a really good, I suppose, thing to describe here is, like, vis-a-vis climate change. So climate change has been caused in the house, but actually the effects are much more felt on the planet and those who are living outside the house. Obviously, like, we could take it literally, our waste, and where our waste is going. So looking at, like, obviously the plastic bottle islands, but also like communities in, like, Indonesia and all around the world who are taking our waste and our recycling as well. Something really interesting that came up actually in our NGO training, and although it was, like, the way I hadn't pointed out, I kind of forgot that it is actually a waste disposal as well. And it was one of the Amnesty volunteers actually who mentioned it. He is from Somalia, and he was saying that war is also taken, like, the way taken away from the house. So if you look at some of, like, the way the recent conflicts around, like, the way Iraq, we kind of nearly, let's have our wars elsewhere, not inside the house, thank you very much. So that was a really, really kind of interesting perspective. Let me see what else. It's basically kind of all our kind of hidden costs. If you look at, say, even how we if we don't want manufacturing to be on our front door, we, the way, put it somewhere else. Sometimes for cheap labor as well. So it's both extraction and kind of waste disposal. We don't want this on our doorstep, so let's put it somewhere. Let's put it somewhere else, not in our back garden. Is often said. Okay, everybody okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously we have got to a stage where within the house that we've run, it's unsustainable growth and overconsumption, and it's in general that's what we're looking at. So although we have taken everything we possibly can from the planet and people living outside the house, we've got to a point now, and a really big tipping point, where the growth that has been supported and continues to be, like, we're still growth at all costs. And that's also, like, the way written, I suppose, in the narrative around global capital, and our growth at all costs model is part, and then overconsumption at the same time, which has been fueled obviously by our expropriation. This is where I think one of the most interesting parts of the house, and it's looking at social mobility. So it's looking at, I suppose, where are the layers in the house, and how we see them. So the north of the north, I guess we're all actually in the north of the north. It would be, I suppose, the apex of the roof itself would be our 1% that we mentioned, like, the 1% that own most of the wealth. But certainly I would consider us as middle class people who have a roof over our head in the north of the north. So just to be really, really clear, that the north doesn't necessarily mean, like, the global north and the global south, but it's more of, like, the way access to privilege. So our access to like, the way your basic rights and your human rights, and you're okay. You have a very low intensity struggle around how you're affected by environmental issues, or you're affected by human rights issues. The south of the south live outside the house. So this is, I suppose, the most marginalized communities are in the south of the south, and that's why they're there, because, and the people who don't have access to rights because of what we've done in the house, the people's environment and land that we've affected because of building the house. Okay, the north of the south. And that would be, I suppose, just to say that it isn't all cut and dry. It's not like, the way we're in the global north, we're in the west, if you like to call it. But it is, like, the way also about people who are privileged. It, as I said, it is that thing. It's not like the developing countries are poor, the developed countries are rich. Okay. There's also the south of the north, and it's an acknowledgement who are living in the basement of the house. So this is to acknowledge power, like, the way poverty is everywhere. There's inequality everywhere. Where this is, I suppose, the way it is that there is a promise completely, and this is part of our universal knowledge and our dominant narrative of the promise of the middle class, that, the world, also part of our dominant narrative is that we're all kind of striving for social mobility, and we're all, almost, the media, everything is telling us to kind of strive for this social mobility and climb up the ladder. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose the yellow arrow here is basically because there's structural damage on the house. Okay, so it's only, I suppose, in well, in the last while that we've really, the cracks have been, beginning to show. And kind of one great, strongest example is around, like, the way climate change. Okay, we can't live like this any longer. And I suppose mental health would be a huge one of them as well. So it's like to acknowledge that the cracks are growing. However, we're still like not acknowledging the hidden costs of our thing. And that's, I suppose, an argument for when, I suppose, teachers focus too much maybe on on things that directly affect us here in Ireland, say. That it's only kind of focusing on these crises, but still not acknowledging the hidden costs which built the house and continue our lifestyle in the first place. Because after all, we're all like, the way there's low intensity struggle and there's high intensity struggle, and we're certainly in a low intensity struggle in the north of the north. But where the most highly intense struggle is felt is those who are living outside the house. And really, like, the way, for example, Aoife, that was brilliant that you said, like, the way that our emissions is one of our waste disposals. So obviously climate change as well is another good kind of example where, like, the causes are in the house, the effects are felt very, very strongly and more intensely elsewhere. Okay, so that is the first part of the House of Modernity. This part is more about, like, the human that's actually living in the house. So that's one of the mad things. This is how I kind of remember. Oh, sorry, I just meant to mention as well that I suppose the cracks that are kind of even more apparent now in the planet would be armed conflict, obviously, forced migration. So they're the cracks that are being felt even more intensely in the planet and in the south of the south. Right now, you can see that on that particular drawing there. So it is all, I suppose, one really good word that is brought up consistently with this model is violent. They, like, they describe, I suppose, our unsustainable world as violent, our systematic violence that we've created, particularly in the planet part and exceeding the planet. However, it continues to be the source of our raw materials and our labour, and we're still very much living on the back of that. This is, I suppose, the way I kind of built it as one house, but you can also look at it as in, like, you can look first at the house exceeding the limits of the planet, then look at our, our subsidence within the house maintained by violence. The floors, again, the kind of promise of the universal middle class and our continued dumping areas. So looking at the different kind of layers and floors within the house, and then looking at the structural damage that's happening, that the house actually can't sustain itself anymore. But this part is actually about, the way how, again, it's kind of back to universal knowledge as well, on how we've kind of gone so far into our how we live, into our individual instead of a collective society, that this has actually made it impossible for us to be able to fix the house. All of our solutions have led to just building a similar house, the way, but looking at it in an alternative way. But the houses that have been attempted to be built are not, they're still within the growth model, they're still within the global capital structure. They're still looking at only universal knowledge, and they're still looking at it just being in the nation state. So we need to imagine something much different. So the particular movement that it's from, they said that we have to really let this house die slowly, not like, the way, and I suppose compost it and see what the compost comes out of the compost, like a mushroom. So some of it gets a little bit mad. So not necessarily, and as I suppose I'm quite, I like being able to see solutions as well. So, part of that, I think maybe our teachers aren't quite ready for that, I think, quite yet. But it's I suppose it's good to share some of the theory, and certainly as a frame, the house kind of puts things into perspective, and particularly around the hidden costs that it's taken to grow the house itself. So this second part is really about the reasoning. So why was the house?
Can
yeah,
I just?
You're going to go.
I think I'll have to leave now.
Okay.
Thank you for allowing me in.
No problem,
I
Aidan.
appreciate it, and I think this is very good stuff to and I'd love to participate in other conversations around this area with you, because I think it is we have to figure out where global citizenship education is going, and some of this is there. However, the stuff you're doing, just as a parting shot, but my sense is that what you're coming up with is a subset of a range of arguments around this, and it's valuable within that context. It's a metaphor for a particular political perception of the way the world exists. I think there are other angles on it as well, but this can be valuable in exploring a particular point, and what we can learn from using that model in deepening our understanding. So look, thanks very much for allowing me in.
Oh, it's a shame you couldn't stay. I'd love to.
I know. Aidan, thank you so much. And honestly, you're more than welcome to the way. I think it's really
I'm pushing these days this that it's all about relationships, and trying to figure out what that is, how you can have positive relationships that are nurturing. But I'm trying to move away from the power dynamic idea that it's all about power, and I think there's, I'm not saying I'm not denying power, but so I'm just saying there's different angles, and I'd love to engage in another further conversation sometime if you allow me in.
For sure, and actually we might do one on, so Karen Pashby, who's part of this movement as well, she's actually just published a resource, and it's around our relationships, and it's called like the heads up thing, and it's looking at hegemony. There's a lot of big words in it, ethnocentric, and she actually kind of looks, and originally the model was built on how our kind of north-south relationships are, so it was more for kind of development, international development organizations proper, and how we relate development-wise, so, and what we need to avoid. So that you'd probably be really interested in that. I'll send you, what I have is, I actually have a reading list to follow up on this session. Okay. So I'm going to send that to you.
Okay.
And I'll send you the slides.
I have to go now. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Aidan.
And thank you very much.
Thanks a million. Thank you.
Yay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So this second part is around this second part of the graph, and it's really, it is around like the human being who's in the house, but it's also how we kind of got to this stage in the first place. The way the house was completely built on our fears, which created desires for certain things, and then our perceived entitlements around those. So I'll go into that first. But first I'm going to talk to you about Boxhead, who is basically our individual living in this house. So this is a bit hard to read, so I've kind of made it a little bit more legible. But basically, the way our life has been reduced to just knowing, and it's been reduced to just, the way finding a meaning in things, rather than us kind of using things like our imagination or, as I said, any other type of knowledge. So again, Boxhead would only acknowledge, the way, these are all massive words again, so I've made them as simple as possible in the next graph. But again, that the knowledges outside this are completely worthless. Like, you know, the way you can see there, I rock, therefore you suck. I succeed because I am intelligent and strong, and therefore you are stupid. And so it doesn't mince any words there. So I suppose the theory would say that, but like how our heads are now, and because the box head is there because it's all about brain, not about your heart, not about your gut, not about your other metabolical intelligence that we have as a human, and not, you know, the way, not looking or even acknowledging that. So as it exists at the moment, and this is probably part of all of our frustration with the world, like that we're not, that we haven't solved world inequality, that we haven't like made the significant changes that we want. But they're kind of saying, this movement is saying, we're actually not equipped to create something different than the house, because it's all based on, say, utility maximizing. We're all kind of thinking, well, what's in it for me? I benefit, therefore I will do it. So we'll do something if we benefit from it. These are translations now of those massive words like dialectical and everything. I think they're more understandable a little bit like this. That there must be a logical argument to this.
And actually, can I just come
Yeah.
in? Sorry, and maybe we excuse that behavior by saying it's human nature.
Yes,
So
yeah. Oh my God, that is so
sorry.
brilliant, Aoife. Yeah, it is. Our perceived idea of human nature is actually learnt behavior, or has been learnt somewhere along the way in the construction of the house, that we, you know, that we're actually like wired to just think about ourselves and in a selfish way, which might be true if we're one, but certainly not true if we're adults. You know, so really good point. Like, you know, that you know, we brush things off as human nature quite often when it doesn't necessarily have to be. And like, you know, the way, so is it nature or nurture? And our nurture side has told us that we're individuals, and like, you know, the way, you look after yourself. Like, you know, it's a very Main Féin attitude that our structures have put in place. So brilliant observation. There's a single story of progress, so it's kind of my way or the highway. So these are, as I said, very simple versions of those huge words. I am separate from other species and planets, and they're there for me to use. I am ahead, so therefore you are behind. So obviously I am civilized and educated, so therefore you must be way behind and much more backwards than I am. There's a linear path with an end to it. So, like, you know, where we have objectives set, which we all believe in, and we have, like, you know, the way, an end in sight. And I suppose a good way, like, you know, I think therefore I am, I think therefore the world is mine, I say therefore it is, I plan therefore it will be, I benefit therefore I will do it, I name it therefore that's all there is, I am here and now therefore you were there, and then, and I rock therefore you suck. So this is in the actual theory, I kid you not. So anyway, box head, this is why maybe, like, you know, the way things have not changed, because it's almost like the individual is the house now, if you know what I mean. But I suppose it's at the same, because the head is so big, it's an acknowledgement of things that are excluded and not really taken as serious. Like, you know, your gut feeling, your intuition, erotic even, they put the hilarious, they've put in there, aesthetic, or other than our relationships with other than humans are not considered when it comes to this. So I've put this into, like, you know, the way, this is more legible. So if the house was built basically around our fears of scarcity, which has led to a desire for accumulation, which has, like, you know, the way we're like, okay, we need to accumulate property and, you know, minerals, everything. We have to own things to I guess get over this fear of scarcity. Very, very simple, you know, recent example would be our kind of toilet paper during COVID.
And the other one is,
but it on a larger scale, it is around, like, you know, the way the really big issues like expropriation and extraction, that, you know, the way let's get as much as we possibly can at all costs. And you'll see that, I suppose it's a good way to describe kind of the 1%, that no matter how much they have, we want, you know, it's our entitlement to just keep accumulating, like, you know, it doesn't matter if we've had enough, but just keep on accumulating. So this is really, I suppose, around our consumer society as well, that we continue to just accumulate at all costs. Our fears around worthlessness has kind of led us to, like, you know, the way wanting certainty, wanting representation and identity and belonging. So I really can't argue with that, but it is, like, you know, I suppose it's recognizing the fears that got us to the construction of the house in the first place. I think probably the most useful to describe kind of, like, you know, the way how we're living today is the very, very first one. So I suppose the sense of meaninglessness, and I think Aidan brought up a really good point there around, like, you know, the way, you know, there was religion, and then there's, like, you know, the way a secular state now. So, you know, people are still looking for meaning in things. And sometimes that meaning is found by buying yourself a new dress or buying your, you know, that it's, I suppose, we've been left without religion. Not that we should go back to it, but just with a kind of, like, you know, the way wanting a sense of meaning.
Belief system, maybe.
Yeah.
And actually it's interesting because Aidan did bring that up about emotion.
Yes. Yeah.
Going back to that, isn't it?
It is definitely. It's like our emotional and our rational, and we've lost. So I think, like, you know, the way when I was looking at, like, how it fits into kind of components, I think there's a lot around where we say kind of attitudes and values in Dev Ed, like, you know, are important around, like, you know, the way having empathy and everything like this, but it is around, like, you know, your emotional rather than what would your emotions say rather than your rational side on different issues and on different global issues. So I suppose this kind of sense of the desire for conformity has led a little bit to universality and a dominant culture, like, you know, the way a dominant way of looking at culture, and it's wanting, again, it's connected in with that ladder of, you know, wanting the social mobility, like, you know, the way, because there is a kind of a dominant monoculture, we're all kind of striving for just that, and that dominant culture is very much connected with consumerism. So that's probably a little bit, anyway, so I suppose just the rest of them there, power, on, you know, our fears are our fears. And I do think that is human nature to feel these fears, but it's the desires and the entitlements which it has created, which has been the problem, and which I think will, I suppose, be very, very hard to deconstruct this house because of our, I suppose, our habit and being used to being entitled to all these things, and believing that it's right that we have these entitlements.
It's a learned behavior, isn't it?
It's a learned behavior. It's a learned behavior. So now that part, as I said, is, you know, some could argue that, you know, again, human nature is, you know, that's, of course we want security, of course we want that, but do we want, you know, our fears and certainly our media literacy, like, I suppose our media of fear has been with us and has been getting ever more intense as the you know, particularly in the last 20 years of, you know, the war on terror, the, you know, the way put it, like media and governments have been putting the fear of God into people, like, you know, the way. So what has that created? That has created, like, you know, I suppose that the rhetoric around Brexit, like people thinking, well, you know, we have to keep all the foreigners out, like, you know, the way it's immigrants who have taken our job security and everything like this. So they misconceived threats, like, you know, the way to their fears. And I suppose that's where the problem is, not necessarily, you know, the way you can't, you know, our human self can't, you know, the way you can't simply say get rid of your fears, because they're there, you know, but they're enhanced by how we live. The 4 denials, I think, are very useful, and certainly yesterday on the call with the idea, this is, I think, what people found kind of most useful, is because also what's kept the house in place is the 4 denials which we have. And the first one, I think, to me, for sure, is something that we're missing kind of most in how we approach global citizenship education, or how, like, you know, it's a denial of systematic violence and complicity in the harm. So obviously it's a denial that we're part of this system that has so many hidden costs to it. The denial of the limits of the planet is, as you know, completely self-explanatory. So we're not, even though, like, there's much more awareness, say, about climate change and you know, us consuming too much, we're still living, you know, and we're still, from the individual up to like government level and to nation level, we're still think, you know, growth is an okay thing, and continuing, you know, that growth, but just looking maybe at from, you know, to the alternative, but still wanting to live in the same way that we do. The denial of entanglement. So this is around our kind of separability and that foundation, that our denial that we're actually entangled up in nature with plants, animals, other beings. So just that we deny that we're actually all part of the one ecosystem. And then the denial of the immensity of the problem itself. So that's where you bring in kind of all the Earth Overshoot Day and things like that, like, you know, the way. But there's a really good, the Treaty of Rome, it was actually in the 1970s, they predicted how, I'll show you the graph, I'll share the graph with you, like, you know, after this. I should actually put it on here. But they predicted in the 70s of our, like, you know, immense running out of resources, and when that would happen. So we've known this for friggin' 50 years. But I like the questions actually around the, like, you know, and the type of questions around these 4 denials, like, you know, how is material prosperity here created by poverty somewhere else? How do poor countries and people, so I don't like how that's phrased really, but people subsidize our comfort, securities and pleasures. How do we benefit from exploitation, and how are we complicit in the harm, and why don't people talk about this? The denial of entanglement. So just to, I suppose, this is also, the entanglement part also looks at, like, you know, our wider living metabolism and our biointelligence. So it's kind of back to kind of our gut as well. And where does the separation between humans and nature come from? And why do we see ourselves as separate from the earth? And what are the consequences of thinking and feeling that we are separated? A really good film, I think it might be a good one for teachers, is Abuelo Grillo, and it's actually around the privatization of water in Bolivia. But she's kind of like, Abuelo is like Abuela, or is like, she's kind of like Mother Earth. And like, so it's interesting, it's interesting on the kind of the denial of entanglement level. But very sweet film, very good, be possibly quite good for Spanish teachers as well, because it's got subtitles, but it's all in well, it's music mainly, but there's some Spanish words in it. So just, I suppose, because we're, as I said, there's structural damage, and the recommendations of what we can do is, like, the way really kind of staying with the storm, kind of digging deeper, relating wider, and kind of really, really building stamina. So whereas I suppose I actually don't think that we're ready as a sector really to move beyond global, this is their model, going beyond GCE or whatever. So they have categories of soft GCE, critical GCE, and beyond GCE. I'm not sure whether we're ready yet. I think actually we have to get people to the stage of critical GCE beforehand. But this, the way I suppose the GCE that they're advocating is about more building resilience in self. But I do think that there's a huge kind of knowledge gap before we do that, to be able to, the way to get that across to teachers. I was thinking maybe actually the theory of change, there's quite a good theory of change exercise that might actually work for our critical approach workshop. So just lastly, and this is just another day really, but this is kind of in Earth's Care model. So do you remember I was saying what their, I suppose, their solution, because I don't really like the word solution either, solution to, I suppose, the house that Modernity built and overcoming this would be to kind of compost our own waste. So that's about your own self, that you actually have to get rid of all your own shit first. Excuse me? That's the words they use. It's a technical term. Compost society's waste as well, and also compost nation's waste to produce something new, or not. But really, it's about, I suppose, if we continue to look for solutions that are still within the same structure, it's not going to work. And even though we don't have a set solution to what we do with this way of thinking, but at least we're making kind of new mistakes, but the way that are not, that are not based on this continued cycle of making the same mistakes over and over again and not learning any lessons from it. So there you go.
Amazing.
Wow,
sorry, that probably took longer than expected, but there's a lot in it, and there's, I don't know about you, there's some things I agree with, there's some things that I'm like, okay. I don't know, and I suppose it's my own learning. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with not having, I suppose, a solution. I suppose it just shows, the way I want solutions. I want to be able to, I'm too impatient to want change, whereas I think this is very kind of long term.
But it's also global citizenship education. Do you want to turn off the video now?
Yeah.